One of the unfortunate facts about game development is that not every project will come to fruition. Most game development studios have had to cancel games over the years, which has led to hours of hard work from a dedicated team almost entirely going to waste. And while it's an unfortunate risk of the industry, and is almost always disappointing to hear about, it's also interesting to take a look at what could have been with these long forgotten projects. Which is why we will be taking a look at some interesting cancelled games today. Some of these were cancelled pretty early into development, only having some screenshots and lines of descriptive text to memorialise their existence, whereas some of these have had some time and effort put in to show what could have become of these developers' ambitions. With the rocky state of the Saints Row series in the current year after the closure of Volition and the polarising reception of the Saints Row reboot, fans of the series must make the most of the games that have already been released. At one point in time, however, Saints Row fans who owned a PSP could have potentially had their own exclusive game entitled Saints Row Undercover. Originally intended to be a full port of Saints Row 2 for the handheld, system limitations would see the game reimagined as a separate story that would chronologically fall after the events of the second game. The game's map, Stillwater, was cut in half to account for the limitations of the PlayStation Portable, and the game would focus on telling an interesting story that saw the player take control of a completely new character to the franchise. After the events of the first two games, with the 3rd Street Saints conquering Stillwater over their gang oppositions, a civil war would break out within the Saints itself that would lead to segmented chapters of the Saints vying for control. Amongst all the chaos, Troy Bradshaw, one of the major characters in the series, would enlist the help of the player character, an undercover cop, to figure out what had caused the civil war amongst the Saints. While the idea of a PSP exclusive Saints Row with its own story and content was an interesting one, the game would unfortunately fail to make it through development, as the playable build that was presented to higher-ups at Volition and THQ was supposedly too buggy and unstable, with the limitations of the handheld effectively ruining any chance of the game being released. Years later, a PSP development kit with the source code for Saints Row Undercover was found, and Volition did the community a solid and released the unfinished build of the game up until that point for free online. So if you have any experience with emulating PSP games, you may be able to see what their ambitions could have produced in the future had the project gone ahead. As a massive fan of wrestling and also a massive fan of games, it's always interesting to look into the history of cancelled wrestling games, like the cancelled MMO titles SmackDown vs Raw Online. But in the case of today's video, we're talking about a WWE game that isn't even really a wrestling game. WWE All-Stars was a game released in the year 2011 and was a spin-off to the mainline WWE titles at the time. The main selling point of the title was to face the superstars of the, at the time, current roster against the stars of the past, with the gameplay focusing on high-impact fighting game-like combat that felt more akin to slamming wrestling figures together than actually simulating a wrestling match. To this day, it's a beloved game that many love, myself included. The game WWE Brawl was considered a spiritual successor to WWE All-Stars, but would unfortunately never be released, despite being quite far into development. WWE Brawl was similar to the Capcom game Power Stone, as it was an open-ended beat-em-up game where players could perform exaggerated wrestling moves that would destroy the surrounding arena. Weapons also played a major role in the game. The superstars on the roster were given larger-than-life cartoon redesigns, and each member of the roster would have had their own stage, created to fit their on-screen characters. WWE Brawl would also have a large focus on multiplayer, which sounds like it would have been a ton of fun, as the multiplayer in WWE All-Stars still holds up all these years later. So why did this game never get released? Well, there are a couple of reasons for why this game was cancelled. Firstly, THQ was going through well-documented issues with funding, so much to the point that they would lose so much cash and actually go bankrupt only a handful of years later. And development of WWE Brawl was simply too complex for the dev team that had been assigned to the project. A playable build of the game for the Xbox 360 is known to exist, as footage of the game in action during the game's development was released by the WWE themselves. It can be found online, and in fact it's probably what you're watching right now. Although to my knowledge, actual playable versions of this build have never surfaced online. However, if you would ever want to get a taste of what this game was going to be like, you technically can. In 2024, so last year, a dev kit copy of WWE Brawl was unearthed by a collector. But if you can believe it, the playable build we have access to is the build for the also cancelled Nintendo DS version of WWE Brawl. Just like the other WWE titles from the time, there was a DS port in the works too, and out of every version, that just happens to be the one we have access to. I won't really talk about this version too much, but it's now playable, so if you want to, go and take a look. It's just ironic that out of every potential version that was being developed, the only one we have access to is probably the last one anyone would probably ask for if they could get WWE Brawl. What a weird world we live in. We go from talking about two games that are confirmed to have been in development and that have actively playable builds that you can experience right now, to a game that isn't even confirmed to have ever made it past the conceptual stage. Despite that fact, I still think this next game is quite interesting as well. Dead or Alive Code Kronos was a highly anticipated but ultimately abandoned project from Team Ninja. It was supposed to be a spin-off from the popular fighting game franchise, but with a significant genre shift. Instead of one-on-one combat, Kronos was planned as an action-adventure game delving into the lore and characters of the Dead or Alive universe. It was also intended to be a prequel to the very first game, which at that time in the series was going back quite a long time. It would have been a very ambitious title. The game was to focus heavily on characters like Kasumi and Ayane, who were series mainstays, as they lived their life before the first Dead or Alive title. The mysterious origins of those and many other characters from the series undoubtedly being delved into throughout the course of the game. It was supposed to also feature elements of story like time travel and the mysteries surrounding it. But unfortunately, the title would be cancelled for numerous reasons. The project was quietly cancelled by Team Ninja, with them citing development challenges and a shifting focus towards other projects. Not to mention the fact that Itagaki, the man behind the series, would actually leave the team, effectively handing over Dead or Alive to the team when leaving. The game was allegedly in development purely for the PS3, although that doesn't really make all that much sense, as the Dead or Alive series had also had a pretty interesting history with the original Xbox and the Xbox 360. It's a shame that this game never released. The Dead or Alive series, out of all fighting games that are really popular right now, seems to be the one that people know the least about when it comes to the lore and story of this. These next two titles will be a little bit like a lightning round, if you will, because not much is really known about these cancelled games, or the reason that they were cancelled is not all that complicated, although they're still very interesting. Robotech Crystal Dreams was a cancelled video game under the development studio GameTech for the Nintendo 64, and was intended to be an adaptation of the widely influential and popular anime series of the same name. It was officially announced in May of 1995, and initially slated as a launch title for the console. For what we know about this game, it looked like it was going to be a graphically intensive and large in scope space combat simulator that used a lot of plot elements from the source material to appeal to fans, while also pushing the hardware of the Nintendo 64 considerably, including features such as characters from the series that could be talked to and interacted with, and a game mechanic that allowed the player to transform their mech to account for different combat scenarios. Unfortunately, as we know, the game was cancelled, and what's sad about this game being cancelled is that some sources report that the game had been around 90% complete when it unfortunately got the axe. Issues like the limiting hardware of the N64 were prime suspects, but the primary issues surrounding this game were the developer GameTech simply running out of money and not being able to finish or release the game as complete. They also failed to attain a publisher for the title, and due to being a relatively small, unknown studio at the time, they were unable to release or self-publish the game, especially with such a license as Robotech, which at the time was quite large. Bounty Arms was a cancelled overhead action game in development by Data West for the original PlayStation. Planned for release in April of 1995, it never saw the light of day, though a playable demo was later discovered. The game was an isometric-like title that saw the player take control of two anime-inspired characters with robotic arms, as they fight through large amounts of enemies in different locations and take on intimidating bosses. Why the game was cancelled isn't actually known, but a demo version of the game that was featured in a Japanese kiosk demo disc was unearthed that allowed players to play through the first half of level 1. I have read that with a GameShark device or other PS1 hacking tools, you can actually force the game to continue past the point that the demo cuts off the player, but I can't speak on that fact. As far as I know, it could be a rumour, but it would be pretty interesting to see a little bit more of what the developers had in mind for this interesting title. This one hurts on a personal level because Black is one of my favourite first-person shooters. Black was a first-person shooter released on the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox by Criterion Games, who you may know as the developers behind the beloved Burnout racing game series. The game was very well received for its gunplay and its focus on impactful guns and visual effects that make every gunfight feel cinematic and intense. Seriously, if you haven't played Black, give it a try, it's a lot of fun. The earliest signs of development on a sequel that we know of is dated June of 2006 and was seemingly in development for the Xbox 360. We don't have any gameplay of these builds to my knowledge, but we do have some screenshots of both builds. The game was seemingly in development until 2007, but what actually caused this game to be cancelled is mostly left up to speculation, with the most reasonable theory being that the team at Criterion were more focused on development of the game Burnout Paradise. It's been theorised that the team were working on an updated port of the first game, but that could also be false. A few years later, a spiritual successor to Black was released on the Xbox 360 called Body Count. It's not very well known, and while I have heard some good things about it over the years, I would have loved a new game in the Black series, or even a port or update. What a shame. And finally, another unfortunately cancelled game based off of an underrated title in my opinion. Blur was a racing game that broke the mold a bit when it came to its mechanics, as the game was focused on things like power-ups, offensive and defensive driving, all wrapped up in a more kart racer-esque arcade gameplay style, but it also featured a large roster of licensed vehicles from worldwide popular brands. While the game was a solid title, it received good reviews. The game was effectively kneecapped by its release date, as it released in May of 2010 alongside titles like Red Dead Redemption, Call of Duty Black Ops, and Assassin's Creed. Despite the poor performance of the game sales-wise, a sequel was in the works at Bizarre Creations. Blur 2 was going to expand on the formula of the previous game while adding mechanics such as wall riding, and a whole host of new tracks and cars. A playable build of the game in its early production phase exists and is probably what you're looking at right now. Updates to the car list were being made, with some notable vehicles being the Lightning Car Company Rocket and Ultima Evolution, which were actually finished vehicles. The Shelby GT500 Eleanor, the Roof RGT8, and the 2007 Shelby GT500 were also supposedly part done, with many more cars most likely being planned. The reason for Blur 2 being cancelled is chalked up to two major factors, that being the closure of Bizarre Creations, the game's developer, as well as the poor performance of the game James Bond 007 Bloodstone. And there you have it, ladies and gents. That's the list of 7 interesting cancelled video games. We took a look at titles from some major franchises. We took a look at games that never made it that far into development, or in one case even beyond the conceptual phase. And we took a look at some games that genuinely had potential to be a lot of fun had they ever been released. And what I want to know is, what was your favourite entry in this list? Do you have any love for Black like I do? Do you wish Saints Row Undercover had have came out? Do you wish to see the prequel story of the Dead or Alive universe in Code Kronos? Either way, I just hope you enjoyed watching, and I enjoyed making the video, because I do have a very large interest in these cancelled games and lost media. So I hope to join you again sometime soon with maybe another video like this. If you want to, I've just recently released a video talking about Roblox and their inability to protect their child fanbase. If you want to take a look at that, I think that's very interesting. I'm quite proud of it. But either way, I'm glad you watched this video, and I'm glad you hopefully had a fun time. Take it easy.